Committee, very glad to see you all here this evening for what should be a very good and certainly appropriately timed program. A couple of announcements on behalf of the library and upcoming programs. We've got a busy January. Some of you here might be interested that on Saturday, January 20th is a workshop for teens in drawing manga. Anybody who's interested in that can sign up for the class. So a little bit of Japanese stuff at the library on that Saturday. And on Tuesday, January 23rd, the Science Museum of Minnesota will be here with a program for kids on Antarctica. It fits in with the Reading is Cool winter reading program for kids that's going on in the community. And I really want to point out your attention to the program that is 2 weeks from tonight, and that is the one with Professor Mark Borrello. It's the fourth in our University of Minnesota Visits Grand Rapids series. And this interesting program is dealing with evolutionary theory in the 21st century, why Darwin still matters. Professor Borrello's field is the history of biology, one of the more interesting fields that I've ever encountered. And I asked him if he would put into context for us as part of that, how did evolution become the cornerstone of modern biology? What was biology like before? What impact has it had on biology? So yeah, that should be a very interesting one. And Friday and Saturday, the 26th and 27th, is a training session for people interested in leading a discussion on Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury, the Big Read Project. So if anybody's interested in getting involved with that, there is the opportunity. And there's flyers on the table back there on these things. There's also evaluation forms. Those evaluation forms also have space for you to give us ideas of future programs that you would like to see. Please take advantage of that. And tonight, one thing, as Bob gets started, he wants to involve the audience in some discussion and some give and take with him, but to accommodate the TV, and you know our programs now go all the way over to Nashwauk and they go far up north. We've got greatly extended coverage on those from the library. We're very glad about that. But to accommodate the TV, if you would please stand and talk loudly, then we think we can pick you up on the TV. And to introduce our speaker tonight, Teresa Alto.
Tonight, we are fortunate to have an opportunity to reflect on the legacy and life of the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. Not by listening to his familiar I Have a Dream speech, though no matter how many times I listen to that speech, it still brings tears to my eyes. And not by learning more about the breadth of Martin Luther King's vision, such as a speech I heard a couple of years ago on public radio in which Martin Luther King discussed the savagery of the Vietnam War. Tonight, instead, we get to touch Martin Luther King Jr. in the way that stories let us touch people. Martin Luther King Jr. is remembered by history for his wonderful speeches, his eloquence, but of course, most of all, for the tremendous revolutionary success of his nonviolent actions. Actions like the Selma to Montgomery marches, which took 3 times in the face of violent opposition from the white establishment, killings of some marchers, and grew from 500 people to 65,000 people by the time it reached the courthouse, the Capitol in Montgomery, Alabama, to fight for voting rights for Black Americans. But Bob Beech can tell us about setting up the tent city every night for those thousands of marchers on the road for those 12 or 13 days. He can also tell us about sitting with Martin Luther King at the end of a long day as Martin Luther King sat there in his suit and dress shoes that he'd walked 12 miles or so in. Tonight we'll also be reminded that ordinary people were part of Martin Luther King Jr.'s great crusade to change the course of American history and bring racial justice to this nation. People like Bob Beech became extraordinary because they chose to live by their ideals. We will find out tonight what it was like for a young pastor from Illinois to move with his wife, Joan, who is here tonight.
Actually,
it was another
quite.
Wife.
It actually took me 2 times to get it right.
All right. That's okay. We'll amend that story. But there were 3 small children.
That's true.
To Hattiesburg, Mississippi, where Bob became director of the Hattiesburg Ministers Project. As director of the Hattiesburg Ministers Project, which was an ecumenical organization that fought for civil rights for Black Americans, Bob Beech served as a contact point for church volunteers from all over the world who came to the South to work on voter registration drives and to teach in freedom schools for Black children, teaching them the basics that they were not taught in schools, and also teaching them the importance of citizenship and civic involvement. These volunteers slept on mattresses, 18 to 20 at a time, in the back room of the small office of the Hattiesburg Ministers Project. Through his work in this project in the Delta Ministry, Bob Beech became acquainted with all the major civil rights leaders of his time. For the last 20-odd years, however, Reverend Beech has lived in northern Minnesota and has become part of our communities. And has served us as a community organizer and activist, in part through the Blandon Community Leadership Program, then through the McKnight Foundation, and also as a pastor in Goodland and Warba, among other roles. So tonight he takes us, his neighbors, back 40 years to the 5 years he spent in Mississippi with national heroes like Martin Luther King Jr. to guarantee civil rights for all Americans. So please join me in welcoming Reverend Bob Beech.
I'm playing with my new toy. Just got this thing not too long ago, so if you see me moving around, jump to the side. I guess one way to start is to just simply remember an evening over 40 years ago when I was sitting in the living room in my house in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. There were a lot of people there because we were celebrating the birthday of a young woman named Raylani Young. And the other thing we were doing was congratulating her, I guess I would say, on being one of 2 Black students who had enrolled and gotten into the University of Southern Mississippi, which is in Hattiesburg. If you know anything about that university, it's probably something like the fact that that's where Brett Favre graduated. That school quietly and peacefully accepted these Black students, quite different from some of the other stories from that same period of history. And Raylani was one of 2 who did that, and we were kind of congratulating ourselves and congratulating her that had just happened. So the living room was full of people, and there were cars, of course, parked outside, and the phone rang, and I got up and went into the bedroom, which is off to the side and on the front of the house, to answer the phone so I wouldn't disturb whatever was going on in the room. And as I stepped into the room and picked up the phone, the whole big front window in the house disappeared with a loud bang, and the curtain that was there kind of drifted inward as it caught all the buckshot from the gun that had been fired through the window at me. And they missed. It was really clear that the whole thing had been set up, that the phone call had happened the way it did, and that whoever did all this or set it up knew me and knew the layout of the house well enough to understand where I would be standing when I picked up the phone. What they didn't understand was that I actually decided to stand on the right-hand side of the little table where the phone was instead of on the left-hand side of the little table. And so all of this lead just kind of blew right by me, and a lot of it ended up in the wall across the room behind me. And there's a picture in this book about the aftermath of that, so if you're curious about it, you can see the picture and me. I guess the reason I wanted to start there was because I want to make the point that those kinds of experiences were not the rule. Those kinds of experiences were, I guess I would call it, say, little exclamation points that would come along now and then. What I guess I'd like to try to convey this evening about me and the others that were with me, and about Martin King and anybody else that you might have heard about or read about, is that all of us lived daily lives while this was all going on. When we read about it, or when we hear about it, we hear about the big events, right? Like the marches and the times that Dr. King was in jail, or some of those kinds of events. Somehow they seem to be the ones that come to the front in stories that are told now this much later. What I think is important to realize is that daily life for all of us went on in the midst of all of this. We'd get up in the morning, we'd have breakfast, get the kids ready and send them off to school, come home in the afternoon, play with the kids, have an evening. This particular evening turned out to be a little more exciting than most. But life had a lot of normalcy in it. If any of you have had a chance to talk to soldiers that are in Iraq now, and you ask them, what is it like? And you stay around long enough to listen, there are big chunks of normal in the middle of all the stuff that's going on, because we can't, none of us are set up to live on the edge 24 hours a day all the time. I think the reason that coming back from a war is so damaging is that you do live on the edge a whole lot more, way, way more than I lived on the edge while I was in Mississippi. So I guess that's a point that I just want to offer for you to think about, that out there in any of these situations that we may talk about tonight is a world of pretty much daily normal behavior that cushions everything else. Now, having said that, I think the way I'd like to begin this evening is to talk some about what I guess I would call the larger context into which everything that Dr. King did and all of the kinds of things that I was involved in fit. For starters, how many of you know personally somebody other than me who got involved somewhere with civil rights work? Not necessarily in the Deep South, or maybe there also. How many of you know somebody? Can you share a little bit? Can you just say a little bit about kind of who and how and when? You know, we don't need long speeches, and we do need you to stand because Don said so.
My dad was a congregational minister in Raleigh when I was born in 1954, and we lived there till 1960. And during that time, of course, I was just a little girl, but I appreciate what you say about just normal life. That's all I remember was normal. But I do know that I remember that something was special because I knew that we had, we got together with a black church in town, our church, and that church did several things together, including a Bible, vacation Bible school. And I knew that that was different to be in an integrated Bible school from everything around us. I knew that it was different to have Martin Luther King come and talk at our church and have a potluck dinner at this black church. I just barely remember those things. But then when we moved to New Haven when I was 6, it was that following summer that the Freedom Rides happened. And my dad came home one day and apparently told my mom, well, I guess I'm going to wherever it was he got on the bus. He and Bill Coffin from Yale and a couple of other students from Wesleyan University headed down and got, after the first buses had been attacked, they got onto the second wave of buses, and within a couple of days had been arrested, and that was, you know, they were in jail a few days, they were bailed out, they came home, and eventually all those cases went to the Supreme Court. But to me, what that meant was that and my dad never really talked much about any of this. He was involved in a lot of community stuff in New Haven as well. But what it meant to me as just someone who was 5 and 6 years old was that I always carried something in me that there was a little thought in there that was always, my dad was a freedom rider. And I think it's interesting how those things can, just some little thing will carry on in somebody that you don't really expect as a very important part of them and how they see the world from then on.
Thanks for sharing that. Anyone else willing to share a little bit about something that you know about personally or experienced, or someone you know? Okay. It looked from the hands as if several could, though. And that's I guess, part of the point that I wanted to make. And the way that this fits for me is that what I know happened with me just about 5 years worth of my life, and what I know happened to many others, in every single case turned out to be life transforming. When I think about what happened in Mississippi for me, and also in Alabama and other places, what I realize is that I got an education during those years, and my teachers, many of them never even completed grade school, but they taught me some things that I wouldn't know sitting here today had I not gone to be there during those 5 years. And so I came away from that time in life feeling very humble and very lucky to have happened into that particular point in history. As we moved our family from Illinois to Mississippi, my in-laws were really, really angry at me because they saw their little grandchildren being hauled off to, I think they would have probably said something like deepest, darkest Africa, or, you know, some kind of very negative language that would have popped into their head to describe this. What they didn't have any way of knowing was that in Hattiesburg, right then, when we were there, the schools were being integrated, and the teachers who had graduated recently from the University of Southern Mississippi and who were teaching the first grade class where my oldest son, Ed, was in first grade, had decided that the thing that they would do with that year was to divide the school year into 4 parts, and they would teach 1/4 of that year about black life and history, 1/4 about Asian, 1/4 about Hispanic, and 1/4 about white. Now, do any of you have children that did that in the first grade? So there we were, a surprise right then, and for a long time Mississippi has solidly tacked down the bottom 50 out of 50 on many of the measurements that people have about education. That didn't happen for us. My next stop after those 5 years in Mississippi happened to be a little village called Cambridge. There's a school there, I guess they call it Harvard, And I was fortunate enough to get a scholarship, a fellowship, to go there for a while. And we enrolled our kids in school there, in the public school system in Cambridge. Our kids, all of them that were in school, were ahead of where the classes were in Cambridge. And so, put that in your pipe and smoke it. We don't always see accurately unless we're there to look somehow beneath the radar. And so I guess I'm trying to say to you that all that goes on that you read is not all that goes on. And that's certainly true even of what I say tonight. You'll find that I have biases, and that's just because that's who I am. Now, the other thing I want to say as a kind of a general backdrop thing is to remind you a little bit about kind of where Martin Luther King fits into a longer list of people.